The hall glimmered beneath the crystal chandeliers, each light reflecting off polished glasses and silver cutlery like a stage set for perfection. Strings played softly in the background, weaving through the quiet hum of conversation. At the center of it all stood Margaret, poised in a cream silk dress that shimmered whenever she moved. For 60 years she had imagined this night, a celebration of endurance, devotion, and the quiet triumph of love. Edward stood beside her, wearing the same dark suit he'd worn to their 50th anniversary, his boutonniere fresh and perfectly pinned. His smile was wide but stretched too thin, as though it belonged to someone else entirely. Margaret, practiced at reading the smallest shifts in his posture, noticed it, the way his fingers tapped restlessly against the champagne flute. But tonight, she told herself, wasn't the night to think too hard. Tonight was about them. The host signaled her gently. Margaret stepped toward the microphone, a soft hush falling across the room. The weight of 6 decades pressed on her shoulders, but it was a weight she carried proudly. 60 years, she began, her voice clear yet trembling with something deeper than nerves. 60 years of shared laughter, difficult winters, and endless mornings where love outlasted everything. The crowd murmured softly, their faces glowing with admiration. Margaret's gaze drifted to Edward. He has been my partner, my anchor, my stubborn, infuriating, wonderful man, and even when we stumbled, we always found our way back. That's love. It's not perfect. It's real. She didn't notice the faint, nearly imperceptible way Edward shifted his weight from one foot to the other. But she felt it, the way a storm announces itself with air too still to trust. Applause rose like a wave, warm and genuine. Margaret smiled graciously, accepting the flowers offered by their grandchildren and the camera flashes that followed. Edward lifted his glass to join her. "To us," he said, the words practiced, smooth, almost too smooth. When he leaned to kiss her cheek, his breath was shallow. He held her for the camera, but not for her. The warmth she expected wasn't there. Margaret's smile didn't falter, but a tiny ripple moved through her chest. She scanned the room. Familiar faces, family, friends, distant relatives. Everyone was exactly where they should be. And yet, beneath the music, beneath the clinking of glasses, she felt an unfamiliar undercurrent. A tremor no one else seemed to hear. She brushed it away like a stray hair and straightened her back. It was nothing, just age, nerves, sentimentality. "Shall we dance?" Edward asked softly, but his eyes didn't quite meet hers. They walked to the center of the polished floor, where a single spotlight followed their steps. His hand rested lightly against her back, almost too lightly. Their first dance began, the same song from their wedding decades ago. Margaret let herself sink into the rhythm, forcing warmth into the cold edges forming in her chest. But as she looked up at him, she saw it. Not love, not joy, but the ghost of distraction flickering behind his carefully rehearsed smile. Something distant, someone else. For the briefest moment, Margaret forgot the music, the people, the lights. A chill passed over her like an uninvited breeze. The applause that followed their dance sounded distant in her ears, as though she was already stepping into a story she didn't recognize. The night, wrapped in elegance, had begun to shift, and Margaret, though she couldn't name it yet, felt the first fracture forming quietly beneath the celebration. Dinner was served beneath the golden light of chandeliers that dripped like frozen fire. Crystal glasses caught the gleam of candles. Silverware chimed softly as servers moved with careful precision. Margaret sat at the head of the long banquet table beside Edward, surrounded by smiling faces that blurred into a soft, pleasant noise. For a moment, the music and the chatter stitched the party together like silk, but something underneath that perfect surface had already begun to strain. Edward shifted again, just as he had during the speech, but this time Margaret felt it more clearly. His hand hovered above the wineglass longer than it should have, his gaze flickering past the guests. She followed his line of sight. Across the table, seated a few places down, was a woman Margaret didn't immediately recognize. She wasn't overdressed like some of the guests trying to impress. Her black dress was simple, elegant, deliberate. Her auburn hair was pinned low at the nape of her neck. She wasn't talking much. She wasn't trying to be seen. Yet she was unmistakably present. Edward's eyes lingered on her for half a second too long. Then, when he noticed Margaret watching, he forced a laugh at something their son had said. A beat late, like an actor missing his cue. Margaret tilted her head slightly, pretending to listen to the conversation around her. But her mind was no longer in the room. She observed. She counted. Twice more, Edward glanced toward the same woman. And twice more she looked back at him, not with shock or discomfort, but with a kind of soft familiarity, as if they were speaking in a language no one else could hear. The server filled her glass with Chardonnay. Margaret's hand tightened around the stem. 60 years, she thought. 60 years of watching this man breathe, laugh, falter, age. I know when he lies. She leaned a fraction closer to Edward. Are you all right? Her voice was gentle, almost rehearsed. He didn't look at her. Of course, he murmured, cutting into his steak. A subtle tremor ran through his hand as he set down the knife. Not a big tremor. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but Margaret did. She always did. A moment later, their eyes met, Edward's and the woman's, not directly, not brazenly, but in a soft curve of movement. He brushed his thumb across the base of his wine glass, and the woman responded with the slightest tilt of her head. It wasn't a smile, it was a signal. Something inside Margaret went very still. The room was still loud, laughter, silverware, music. But for her, sound narrowed to the faint hum of blood rushing in her ears. She looked at the woman again. She seemed younger than Margaret, but older than their children, someone who had carefully chosen to wear restraint as armor. Their eyes met, just for a heartbeat. Evelyn's gaze didn't flinch. She didn't look embarrassed or startled. She simply held it, then lowered her lashes. Margaret's throat tightened. She forced herself to take a sip of wine, though her hand was shaking slightly. As the waiter cleared the plates, Edward leaned toward the master of ceremonies, whispering something. He avoided Margaret's gaze entirely. Evelyn rose from her seat as if following a rhythm Margaret couldn't hear. She disappeared into the side corridor near the back of the hall. Edward's fingers tapped once against the table. A quiet signal. Familiar. Intimate. Margaret had seen that gesture before, years ago, when it was meant only for her. The air in the room shifted. For everyone else, it was still a party. But for Margaret, the celebration was turning into a crime scene without evidence, a mystery without words. She straightened her shoulders, smiled politely at a passing guest, and fixed her eyes on the corridor Evelyn had vanished into. Something had cracked. It wasn't loud, not yet. But she had heard it clearly. Margaret's heels echoed softly against the marble floor as she stepped away from the banquet table, each click puncturing the noise of the celebration. The laughter behind her grew faint, dissolving into something distant and irrelevant. The warmth of the hall, the music, the lights, they all seemed to belong to a world that no longer included her. The corridor was dimly lit, quiet, with muted sconces casting pale yellow pools along the walls. She stopped halfway down and leaned against the cool surface, feeling her pulse thrum beneath her skin. She had always believed that betrayal came like thunder, loud, destructive, undeniable. But this was a whisper, a hairline fracture she couldn't unsee. Her mind pulled her backward. The images came too easily. Edward holding her hand on the steps of their first home. Edward pacing nervously outside the hospital room when their first child was born. Edward laughing so hard on their 25th anniversary, he spilled champagne down his tie. A lifetime of ordinary moments wrapped in what she thought was certainty. Margaret squeezed her eyes shut. 60 years. What did I miss? What did I ignore? For years she had sensed the quiet spaces between them growing wider, but she'd patched them with gentle excuses. Age, habit, time, not disloyalty. Never that. Edward was the constant, the quiet center she built her life around. A soft rustle behind her. Edward's voice. "Margaret?" She straightened instantly, pushing her shoulders back, masking the storm beneath her skin. He appeared at the end of the corridor, jacket unbuttoned, tie slightly askew. His face was arranged into something calm. Too calm. "There you are," he said lightly, as though nothing had shifted, as though their lives hadn't tilted toward some hidden edge. "I needed some air," Margaret answered. Her voice sounded steady to her own surprise. He walked closer. "You disappeared in the middle of dinner. Are you all right?" She studied his face closely. It was a face she knew better than her own, and yet something about it now felt foreign. "I'm fine," she said, though she wasn't. "I was just watching." He tilted his head. "Watching what?" Margaret's gaze sharpened. "You, her, the looks." For the briefest moment, a flicker crossed his eyes, barely there, like a shadow. But then he smiled. It was effortless, practiced. "I don't know what you think you saw." She took a step forward, her voice low. "I've spent my entire life reading you, Edward. I know when you're hiding something." He let out a small laugh, the kind meant to soothe or dismiss. "Darling, it's a party. People look at each other. That's all." "Not like that," she whispered. The air between them thickened. Edward's hands went into his pockets, his stance casual, but too deliberate. "Margaret, you're tired. This night means a lot to both of us. Let's not spoil it over." "Nothing. Nothing." The word landed like ice water on her skin. She had weathered every storm beside this man, raised children with him, buried friends with him, built a life on the assumption that he belonged to her as much as she belonged to him. And here he stood, brushing away the splintering edge of their life as if it were nothing. Her throat tightened. "You're lying," she said softly. Not because she had proof, but because she could feel it. Like smoke before a fire. Edward didn't flinch. He simply sighed, that tired, careful sigh she'd heard too many times in their marriage. "Margaret, don't do this. Not tonight." And then, with infuriating gentleness, he reached out to touch her hand, just as he always had when he wanted to calm her. But the touch felt hollow now. Mechanical. Margaret pulled away. The music from the hall floated faintly into the corridor, mocking in its sweetness. She realized the betrayal had been sitting quietly in her house for years, wearing his familiar face. She stared at him for a long moment. He stared back, unblinking, offering nothing. Then, without another word, she turned toward the ballroom. But the night no longer felt elegant. It felt dangerous. Somewhere behind the soft music and laughter, a secret waited like a loaded trap. Margaret stood at the edge of the ballroom, her heart beating against her ribs like a muffled drum. The echo of Edward's calm denial still burned in her ears. "You're imagining things, Margaret." That single sentence, delivered so smoothly, so rehearsed, had twisted the air between them. She had lived beside this man for 60 years. She knew the subtle cadence of his lies. The dinner plates were being cleared, waiters weaving between guests with quiet grace. But beneath the elegance, a different rhythm pulsed. Low, anxious, electric. Margaret's gaze slid across the room toward Evelyn. The younger woman's laughter was too precise, too restrained, like a performer conscious of her every movement. And Edward couldn't stop glancing at her. Margaret's hands tightened around the edge of the champagne flute until the glass trembled. She forced a smile as one of the guests, a woman in pearls, complimented her on the evening's beauty. But behind the smile was a storm-gathering weight. She turned toward the entrance, needing air, needing space to breathe before her suspicions consumed her. That's when she saw him. A tall man in a dark suit, standing just beyond the soft golden lights of the ballroom. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd with methodical precision. He didn't belong to the sea of familiar faces. Mrs. Callahan, the man greeted as she approached, his voice low and controlled. Detective Harris, I was invited as a precaution by one of your security consultants. Big events like this can get unpredictable. Margaret raised an eyebrow, surprised. Edward hadn't mentioned security at all. Precaution? She echoed. The detective's gaze flicked briefly toward Evelyn. I tend to notice patterns. Your husband has been restless tonight. A chill crawled up her spine. He saw it too. They spoke quietly, away from the chatter. Harris's questions were gentle, threaded with a professional patience. Has anything seemed unusual before tonight? Any strange calls? Changes in his behavior? Margaret hesitated. So many small things she had ignored suddenly surged forward. Late-night phone calls, vague explanations, the sudden urge to host a grand anniversary instead of their usual quiet dinner. She had excused them all. Love makes fools of the loyal, she thought bitterly. Her fingers brushed against the string of pearls on her neck, Edward's gift on their 20th anniversary. She could still remember how he had fastened them gently, whispering promises of forever. Now, those same pearls felt like a noose. Back inside the ballroom, Evelyn leaned against the bar, swirling her drink. Her dress shimmered under the chandelier like a lure cast into dark waters. Edward was beside her, too close, speaking too softly. To anyone else it might seem innocent, a casual exchange. But Margaret saw what others didn't. The subtle curve of Evelyn's smile, the way Edward's hand twitched like a guilty man's. Margaret turned to Harris. If something's about to happen, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I need to know. Harris nodded, pulling a small notebook from his jacket. Then let's keep our eyes open. As music swelled and champagne bubbled, the party's golden illusion shimmered, fragile, trembling. Margaret watched her husband and the woman who wasn't supposed to be there, and for the first time in 60 years, she didn't see Edward Callahan, the devoted husband. She saw a stranger wrapped in familiar skin. And then Evelyn's gaze flicked up, locking on Margaret's. Her smile curved into something darker, not soft, not shy, challenging. Margaret felt her breath hitch as the chandelier lights above dimmed slightly, an almost imperceptible shift that made the entire room tense for a heartbeat. Harris straightened beside her. Something in the air had changed. This wasn't just infidelity. Something deeper was about to break. And Margaret, whether ready or not, was standing at the edge of it. The chandelier trembled faintly, casting delicate fractures of gold and shadow across the ballroom. Guests noticed the dimming lights with soft murmurs, but only a few caught the quick exchange of glances between Evelyn and Edward. Margaret did. She saw everything now. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to keep her hands still on the tablecloth. 60 years of marriage had taught her how to smile through anything, but tonight that mask felt like glass about to shatter. Evelyn tilted her head, a slow, deliberate motion, like a queen surveying a conquered kingdom. Edward tried to look away, but Margaret caught the flicker of panic in his eyes. For decades, he'd been the picture of charm, a man adored by friends, admired by neighbors. But now, that carefully built facade was cracking. Detective Harris lingered near the back of the room, watching the exits, scanning faces with a quiet intensity. He hadn't said a word since the lights dimmed. He didn't need to. His stillness was a warning. Margaret, a soft voice whispered. She turned. Eleanor, her oldest friend, stood beside her in a silver shawl, concern etched into every line of her face. Are you all right? You look pale. I'm fine, Margaret said automatically, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Eleanor glanced toward Edward and Evelyn. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Who is she? Margaret's throat tightened. I don't know. Not officially. Liar, Eleanor whispered. But it wasn't cruel. It was the gentle accusation of someone who had known her long enough to see the truth she refused to admit. The band on the small stage began playing a slow waltz, as if to distract everyone from the uneasy flicker of the lights. Couples rose, gliding to the center of the floor. Margaret stayed seated, hands folded, watching Edward rise too easily from his chair. He moved toward Evelyn, not her, not the wife of 60 years. Eleanor inhaled sharply. "Oh my God." Margaret didn't move. She simply watched as Edward extended a hand toward the younger woman. Evelyn accepted without hesitation. The room rippled with quiet whispers. It wasn't a passionate display, not yet. But it was enough to draw eyes. Enough to feed rumors that would grow teeth by morning. Edward began to dance with her, guiding her across the floor with the same practiced grace he once reserved for Margaret. The memory of their wedding dance flashed unbidden through her mind. A younger Edward, a white dress, promises whispered like prayers. Lies, her heart whispered now. Detective Harris suddenly approached her table. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "do you want me to intervene?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "Not yet. Let him dance. Let everyone see." The chandelier flickered again, longer this time, drawing more attention. A few guests muttered about the power. A waiter dropped a tray, the clatter sharp against the music. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. Then Evelyn leaned in, whispering something in Edward's ear. He laughed. A quiet, intimate laugh she hadn't heard in years. The kind that belonged to private moments, not public stages. Margaret rose. Eleanor reached for her arm, but she gently pulled free. The movement was steady, regal even. She walked toward the dance floor, not like a woman scorned, but like a queen reclaiming territory. Every step echoed softly, swallowed by the music. Edward didn't see her at first. Evelyn did. Their eyes locked, Margaret's cold and cutting, Evelyn's gleaming with a dangerous calm. "Edward," Margaret said softly, but the music couldn't drown it out. People turned. Silence grew like smoke through the room. Edward froze mid-step. "Margaret." "Dance with me," she said. The words weren't a request. They were a demand. For a moment, he hesitated, and the hesitation alone was a wound. Then he pulled away from Evelyn and reached for her hand like a man on trial. The crowd exhaled as if something had been momentarily repaired, but Margaret knew better. The rope was tightening, not loosening. As they began to waltz, she leaned closer, her smile perfect for the cameras and the gossiping guests. "I saw you," she whispered against his ear, "and I'm done pretending." Edward stiffened. "Margaret, this isn't what you think." She cut him off with a soft laugh that sent chills down his spine. "You've always underestimated me." Across the room, Evelyn watched, arms folded, expression unreadable, but her eyes burned with something sharp. Harris shifted his stance. Eleanor's hand clutched her shawl. The air itself felt brittle. The lights flickered once more, this time with a low electric hum that seemed to vibrate through the floor. And in that fragile moment, Margaret's perfect anniversary cracked wide open. Something was coming. And it would not be whispered. The orchestra's waltz fractured mid-bar, the last note hanging in the air like the final thread of an unraveling tapestry. Margaret's hand remained in Edward's, but the warmth was gone. It felt like holding on to the ghost of someone she no longer knew. Every face in the ballroom turned toward them. A hush spread like fog. The chandeliers flickered again, longer this time, as if the room itself was listening. Evelyn stood at the edge of the dance floor, her red silk dress pooling around her like a threat wrapped in elegance. She didn't speak, but her smirk said everything. "I'm not afraid anymore." Edward cleared his throat, trying to summon the charm he'd worn like armor for decades. "What's going on with the lights?" he joked weakly, but no one laughed. Even the band lowered their instruments, unsure whether to keep playing. Margaret tilted her head slightly, still holding his hand. "Edward," she said softly, "you've always hated interruptions." Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. It was precise, deliberate, a scalpel, not a hammer. Edward's smile faltered. "Margaret, Not here." "Why not here?" she asked. Her words slid through the silence, sharp as glass. "You brought it here." A ripple moved through the guests, an invisible current of realization and discomfort. Eleanor stepped forward, her shawl brushing the floor. "Maggie," she whispered urgently, but Margaret didn't move. She had waited too long for this moment. Detective Harris didn't interfere, not yet. His eyes followed every twitch of Evelyn's mouth, every bead of sweat on Edward's temple. Years of training had taught him that the truth often surfaced in rooms just like this, under pressure, under too many watching eyes. Edward tried to step back, but Margaret held on. Her grip was iron. "For years," she said, voice trembling not from fear but fury, "I convinced myself you were a good man, a faithful man, my partner. 60 years, Edward. 60 years of building a life, raising a family, defending your name." "Margaret," he hissed through clenched teeth, "this isn't the time." Her smile widened, not with joy, but with the calm of someone standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to jump. "No, darling. This is exactly the time." Evelyn took a step closer. Her heels clicked against the polished floor like gunshots. "Maybe," she said softly. "You should let him explain." The whisper was enough to ignite the room. Gasps fluttered like startled birds. Margaret turned toward her slowly, eyes narrowing, not with hatred, but with the cold curiosity of a woman finally seeing the intruder up close. "And who," Margaret said, her tone quiet but lethal, "gave you permission to speak at my anniversary?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She raised her chin, a defiant queen in enemy territory. "The man you married." The crowd broke into whispers, quick, panicked, hungry, the kind that devoured reputations in seconds. Edward's face drained of color. "Stop this," Edward whispered, but it was too late. Margaret's hand fell away from his. "Do you have any idea?" she said, louder now, voice trembling with decades of buried pain. "What it's like to build a life with someone who was never really yours?" The music was gone. Only breathing filled the space. "Margaret, it's not what you think," Edward pleaded. The woman you've been looking at all night as if I don't exist." A sharp inhale from the crowd. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. Harris straightened subtly, reading the emotional temperature of the room. Edward's voice cracked. "Maggie, please, this is between us." She laughed, a brittle sound that splintered the silence. "Between us? No, Edward. You made it between all of us the moment you brought her here." Evelyn's voice cut in again, this time harder. "He didn't bring me. I came because I'm tired of being a secret." Margaret froze, not because of the words, but because of the ease with which they left Evelyn's mouth. No shame, no guilt. The lights flickered again. The chandelier groaned, as if the house itself felt the weight of their secrets. "Secret?" Margaret repeated, each syllable like a knife. "Yes," Evelyn said, chin lifting. "I've been with him for 12 years. You've been living in a dream." A sound escaped Margaret's throat, half laugh, half gasp. She had imagined betrayal, but not this, not so long. Edward reached for her. "Please, don't do this here." She stepped back. "You already did." The crowd stirred uneasily. Someone whispered, 12 years. Eleanor moved forward, but Harris gently held her back. He knew better than to interrupt a confession. Margaret lifted her head. She wasn't trembling anymore. "You built this life on lies, and you made me the fool who defended you." Her voice carried through the entire ballroom. Edward stood, hollow, words failing him. Evelyn's eyes glittered, not with triumph, but with the cold satisfaction of someone no longer hiding. Margaret looked around at the guests, their stunned faces reflecting everything she had been afraid to face. "Happy anniversary," she said, and it wasn't a toast, it was a verdict. Then, without another word, She walked toward the nearest door. The music never resumed. Edward stood in the center of the dance floor, trapped in the ruins of his own making. Evelyn stared after Margaret, for the first time unsure. Harris moved toward Edward, not to arrest him, not yet, but to watch. The celebration was over, and the reckoning had just begun. The door swung shut behind Margaret with a sound like the end of a song. The echo carried through the silent ballroom, swallowing the last fragile threads of the celebration. For 60 years this night had been meant to honor love. Instead, it now reeked of betrayal. Edward remained on the dance floor like a monument to his own collapse. The same man who once commanded rooms with easy smiles now stood small, shoulders caving in under the weight of his lies. The guests avoided his gaze, whispering to each other in careful, cruel tones. Evelyn stepped closer to him. Her perfume, usually soft and floral, now felt suffocating. "You knew this day would come," she whispered. "You just didn't want to face it." Edward's jaw tightened. "Not like this. Not here." Eleanor pushed through the crowd, the silver shawl slipping from her shoulders. Her heels clicked on the marble floor with steady fury. 12 years, she said, her voice low but sharp. "You lied to all of us, to her." Edward turned to her, but Eleanor didn't flinch. Her friendship with Margaret ran deep, past decades of dinners, secrets, and shared grief. To betray Margaret was to betray Eleanor too. "She didn't deserve this," Eleanor continued. "Not here. Not in front of everyone who's ever loved her." Edward's voice cracked. "I didn't want to hurt her," Eleanor scoffed. "That's exactly what cowards say." The crowd rippled again, small groups breaking off, whispers growing teeth. Someone muttered about lawyers. Another mentioned Margaret's will. And then someone, too loudly, said, 12 years. That's not an affair. That's a second life." Edward's chest constricted. He could feel the walls closing in, each whisper turning into a brick of judgment. He had spent decades building a carefully polished image. One night, one woman, one revelation, and everything collapsed. Evelyn stood beside him, her hand grazing his arm. "We can still fix this," she murmured, but even she didn't believe it. Her voice trembled beneath the veneer of control. Detective Harris stepped forward at last, his steady presence slicing through the chaos. "Mr. Cole," he said calmly, "I'd like to speak with you privately." The room froze. Edward stiffened. "Why?" "Because your wife requested a private security check for tonight," Harris replied. "And after the scene we just witnessed, I think it's wise to make sure there aren't any more surprises." "More surprises." The words slithered through the room like smoke. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Harris said carefully, "this may not be just a marital scandal." Evelyn flinched slightly. It was small, barely visible, but Harris caught it. He was trained for this, trained to read people when the masks fell away. "Edward," Evelyn whispered, fingers tightening around his wrist. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Edward hissed. "Nothing." But Harris saw the panic in his eyes. It wasn't just shame. It was fear. Eleanor folded her arms. "What else are you hiding?" Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again. The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere near the bar, a glass shattered, the sound slicing through the room like a gunshot. People jumped. Tension thickened. Evelyn's expression hardened. "If you won't tell them," she said, voice icy, "someone else will." Edward turned to her slowly. "Don't." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "You think I stayed quiet for 12 years because of love?" She stepped closer. "No, Edward. I stayed quiet because I was waiting." Harris's hand hovered near his jacket pocket. Not for a weapon, but for his recorder. Something in her tone told him this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Eleanor exhaled shakily. "Oh God, what have you done?" The whispers surged like a storm tide. Guests were already edging toward the exits, not because they wanted to leave, but because they wanted to watch without being trapped in the fallout. Edward grabbed Evelyn's arm. "Don't you dare!" She yanked free. You built this lie, Edward, and now it's crumbling. I won't be the one buried with it. Harris's gaze locked on Edward. Mr. Cole, we need to talk. Now. Edward's hands trembled. His entire life had been carefully curated for 60 years, and now, in a matter of minutes, it lay in ruins at his feet, alongside the marriage, the mask, and the secret he never wanted spoken aloud. The ballroom had turned into a stage, and Edward was trapped under its spotlight. Margaret was gone, but her silence now screamed louder than any accusation. Outside the closed doors, the night stretched cold and endless. Inside, the truth was sharpening its teeth. The ballroom no longer looked like a celebration. Tables stood half empty, glasses abandoned, music silenced. What remained was a dense, electric quiet, a quiet that carried the weight of something festering beneath the surface. Detective Harris's steady gaze pinned Edward like a moth beneath glass. Edward's throat felt dry, every breath a struggle against the walls closing in. Evelyn, standing only a few feet away, finally stopped pretending to be invisible. "You're trembling," she said softly. "That's how I know it's time." Edward's jaw clenched. "Evelyn, don't—" "Oh, Edward," she cut in with a bitter laugh. "You've spent 12 years controlling everything, me, your reputation, your wife's reality, but you can't control the truth anymore." The guests, though many had drifted toward the exits, lingered like vultures waiting for the kill. Eleanor stood rigid, arms folded tightly across her chest. Harris's voice broke through the tension. "If there's something more, I need to know it. Now." Evelyn tilted her head, her red silk dress shimmering under the fractured chandelier light. "Oh, there's plenty more." Edward stepped forward, his once proud shoulders now shaking. "You don't understand what you're doing." Evelyn met his eyes with surgical calm. "No, Edward. For the first time, you don't understand what I'm capable of." Harris moved closer, careful but firm. "Ms. Lane, I advise you to be clear. If this involves criminal activity, withholding it won't end well for anyone." A thin smile crossed her lips. "Oh, detective, I'm done withholding." She turned to the room, not just to Harris, not just to Edward, but to everyone who had ever believed the Cole family's perfect image. Her voice was steady now, almost elegant. This affair wasn't about love. It was about money and secrets. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like waves. Eleanor stiffened. Edward looked as if someone had punched the air out of him. "You see," Evelyn continued, "I didn't meet Edward at some romantic dinner. I met him the night someone disappeared." Harris's eyes narrowed. "Who?" Evelyn's smile faltered slightly, but only slightly. "Richard Vale, his business partner. Or, as the papers called him, the man who vanished." Gasps burst from the crowd. The name carried weight. It had been one of the most infamous missing persons cases of the past decade, never solved. Eleanor's hand covered her mouth. "Dear God." Edward took a step toward Evelyn, panic bleeding into his expression. "Stop it. You don't know what you're talking about." But Harris caught the flicker of something else behind the panic. Recognition. "I was there," Evelyn said. "Not at the moment it happened, but before. I saw the two of you arguing. I saw the envelope, the money, the threats." She exhaled slowly. "And I saw him leave with you that night. He never came back." Edward shook his head violently. "Lies!" he shouted, too loud, too desperate. The guests recoiled at the force of it. Harris's voice stayed calm, razor sharp. "Edward, where was Richard Vale that night?" Edward's lips parted, but nothing came out. He stared at Harris, then at Evelyn, then at the door Margaret had walked through. "Tell them," Evelyn whispered. "Tell them how you buried more than a marriage." The chandelier buzzed softly above them, its light unsteady. Eleanor spoke next, voice shaking. "Edward, you told us he went missing after a business trip." Edward looked cornered. He did. He... Don't lie again, Evelyn hissed. Not when I've got the proof. Harris straightened. Proof? Evelyn nodded slowly. I kept it. All of it. The letters, the bank transfers. The night he begged me to keep quiet after Vale disappeared. He thought he could control me with promises. She let out a soft, dark laugh. But power fades when the lies catch up. A low, stunned murmur swept through the guests like a wind through dead leaves. Edward tried to reach for her arm again, but Harris stepped between them this time. Mr. Cole, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. Now. This is madness, Edward muttered, but the fire had left his voice. Harris leaned closer to Evelyn, voice quiet but firm. You realize what you're saying implicates him in a federal investigation. She met his gaze. Detective, I've been waiting 12 years for someone to finally listen. Edward's breath came in ragged bursts. You think this will end well for you? He spat. Evelyn didn't flinch. No, Edward, but it will finally end. The last of the guests began to step back, some fumbling for their phones, others staring wide-eyed as the fairy tale anniversary shattered completely into a crime scene. Somewhere outside, sirens echoed faintly, a sound that seemed to slice through the night. Harris spoke into his radio. We have a situation. Possible connection to cold case. Richard Vale. Edward's hands trembled. Evelyn stood tall. Eleanor's tears glittered, and somewhere beyond the walls of the ballroom, Margaret waited. The night was no longer about betrayal. It was about justice. The air in the dim hallway felt colder than it should have been. Outside, the soft murmur of guests blended with the fading notes of the string quartet. But here, in this narrow corridor lined with framed memories, the silence was a living thing. Edward's breathing came in short, uneven bursts. Margaret stood a few steps away, hands clenched so tightly around the edge of her shawl that her knuckles had turned pale. The ring on her finger glimmered faintly beneath the golden light, the same ring Edward had slipped onto her hand 6 decades ago. It had always felt warm, like a promise made of flesh and faith. Tonight, it felt heavier than iron. Edward, she whispered, voice trembling not from weakness, but from the storm she was trying to cage inside. Who is she? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. His throat bobbed. The mask he'd worn all night, the careful smile, the rehearsed ease, was cracking. The fissures deepened with every second of her gaze. You're imagining things, he said finally, but the words were limp, drained of conviction. Margaret took a step closer. Don't lie to me. Not now. Not after everything we built. That woman. The one in the blue dress. I saw your eyes, Edward. I saw hers. He staggered slightly against the wall, one hand pressed to his temple as if the truth itself was a weight crushing him. It was nothing. Her laugh was quiet and sharp, like breaking glass. 60 years, Edward. 60 years of raising children, of building a life brick by brick. Do not stand here and tell me it was nothing. For a long moment, he didn't respond. His eyes fell to the floor, the same floor where they had once danced barefoot after their 25th anniversary, wine-stained and laughing. He seemed smaller now, like a man standing at the edge of something he could never return from. She was... His voice cracked, dry and thin. Evelyn. Margaret's entire body went still. The name felt like a blade dragging across old wounds she didn't even know existed. Evelyn, she repeated slowly. For how long? His silence was the answer. She stumbled back, hand flying to her chest, as if trying to keep her heart from tearing through it. How long? Edward finally lifted his gaze, and in it was something raw, something almost childlike. 10 years. The corridor seemed to shrink. Her ears rang. The walls pulsed with the echo of that number. 10 years, 10 anniversaries, 10 Christmases, 10 shared breakfasts, all while a quiet betrayal lived beneath their roof like an uninvited ghost. Margaret steadied herself on the wall, every breath a tremor. 10 years, while I stood beside you, while I believed in you. It wasn't supposed to last, Edward whispered, a tear carving a line down his cheek. It started as nothing, and then it became everything, she cut in sharply. While I became invisible. No! His voice cracked through the silence. You were never invisible. You were my everything. Lies, she hissed. The weight of those years pressed between them, thicker than air. For the first time, Edward didn't try to reach for her. He just stood there, hands shaking, as if afraid touching her now would turn him to ash. Margaret's mind spun through fragments of their life. The night he held her during a thunderstorm, the way he brushed her hair behind her ear before every family dinner, the promises they whispered into the dark. All of it now refracted through the jagged prism of his confession. I should hate you, she said softly, but right now, I don't even know who you are. A distant sound broke the moment, the grand doors opening again, the murmur of guests shifting restlessly. Someone called her name faintly from the ballroom. It sounded far away, like a memory fading into fog. Edward wiped his face with a trembling hand. Margaret, please, let me explain. She looked down at her ring again. It didn't feel like a symbol anymore. It felt like an anchor tied to a sinking ship. I don't know if there's anything left to explain, she whispered. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried finality like a bell tolling in a church tower. The tension held between them like a stretched wire, thin, fragile, and one heartbeat away from snapping. Margaret turned toward the sound of the ballroom. The night wasn't over, and neither was the reckoning. She squared her shoulders, every step away from Edward echoing louder than the music. Behind her, Edward finally fell against the wall, sliding down like a man whose sins had finally caught up to him. The ring on her hand glimmered one last time beneath the golden light before disappearing into the shadows. The guests waited. The storm had only just begun. The ballroom was still glowing with warm light when Margaret stepped through the door, but the warmth no longer touched her. Laughter drifted like smoke, floating but fading too quickly. Every chandelier sparkled as if mocking the darkness that had wrapped itself around her heart. She stood for a moment at the threshold, fingers grazing the smooth edge of the doorway, gathering herself like a woman stepping onto a battlefield. Heads turned when they saw her. She was, after all, the guest of honor, the devoted wife of 60 years. Her smile, though brittle, returned to her lips like muscle memory. She had practiced this expression for decades, poised, gracious, untouchable. Edward followed a few steps behind, his face pale, the weight of his confession hanging over his shoulders like a shroud. His tie was slightly loosened now, his steps slower than before. The cracks in his armor were showing. A string quartet swelled in the corner, but the melody felt off. Too fragile, like glass stretched too thin. Guests raised their glasses. Someone clinked a fork against a crystal flute, calling out cheerfully, "A speech from the couple!" The irony burned her tongue like acid. Margaret forced herself to breathe. Not here. Not yet. She made her way toward the head table, the crowd parting instinctively. Her gown brushed softly against the polished floor, a quiet whisper beneath the swelling music. She could feel Edward's presence behind her like a shadow. Silent, but impossible to ignore. And then she saw her. Evelyn. She stood near the edge of the room, half hidden behind a column, wearing that same ocean blue dress. Her hair was pinned up neatly, her expression composed, but her eyes betrayed her. They flicked nervously between Margaret and Edward, a silent current of guilt and longing threading the space. Margaret's pulse roared in her ears. She didn't need to scream. Her silence was enough. She lifted her glass from the table, the stem cool against her palm, and began to speak. 60 years, she said softly, but her voice carried through the room with unexpected clarity. That's a long time to love someone. A murmur of approval rippled through the guests. Couples exchanged warm smiles. Someone even dabbed at their eyes. They thought they were witnessing love at its most golden. Edward froze at her side. Margaret turned slightly toward him, her eyes steady, almost too calm. 60 years of building a life, brick by brick, of knowing every breath, every gesture, every shadow that falls across a familiar face. Evelyn shifted her weight. One wrong move, one too long glance. Margaret caught it. So did two people near the bar. A subtle change in the air, like the moment before a storm hits. Margaret smiled wider, and the crowd leaned in, enchanted by the grace they thought they were witnessing. And yet, she continued, sometimes, what we build can carry cracks we choose not to see, until they grow too deep to ignore. Edward's hand twitched at his side. The crowd's soft hum faltered. A few exchanged curious glances. The band stumbled on a note. Evelyn's glass trembled. A droplet of champagne slid down her wrist like a bead of guilt. Margaret turned fully to Edward now. She looked radiant and terrifying all at once, like a queen wearing a crown made of fire. Marriage, she said, is not about pretending the cracks don't exist. It is about standing in front of them and deciding whether they can still hold the weight. The room went still. Edward's breath hitched, and for the first time that night, Margaret saw it. Not guilt, not fear, but a flash of naked shame in his eyes. The kind that comes when the walls you've built start collapsing around you. Then it happened. Subtle, but fatal. Evelyn's gaze met Edward's for one fraction of a second too long. Someone near the dance floor noticed. A whisper fluttered through the crowd, then another, and another. The whispers spread like fire through dry grass. Margaret lowered her glass with slow, deliberate grace. The storm had slipped from private into public. Edward took a step forward, his voice low. "Margaret, please." But she was no longer speaking just to him. Her words were for everyone now. "Here we are," she said. 60 years. A celebration of love, loyalty, and truth. The crowd froze. Even the music faltered into silence. Evelyn turned pale. Edward's hands trembled. Margaret's heart, though fractured, beat with terrifying clarity. She was done being invisible in the story of her own life. Someone near the back whispered, "What's happening?" But no one dared move. The air in the ballroom thickened. The elegant hall no longer a place of celebration, but of reckoning. Margaret looked down at her ring, its once bright shine dull beneath the chandeliers. She lifted her gaze again, locking eyes with Edward. "You always said this ring meant forever," she whispered. "But forever doesn't survive on secrets." The silence was deafening. The truth was no longer contained in shadows. It lived here now, among chandeliers and champagne, among whispers and widening eyes. And as Margaret slowly placed her glass down, the world she had built for 6 decades began to unravel, thread by thread, in front of everyone. The night had turned. There was no going back. For a few stretched, breathless seconds, no one moved. It was as if the chandeliers had frozen in mid-glow, the air too heavy to breathe. Then, like the faintest crack of thunder, the silence fractured. A woman coughed nervously. A man shifted his glass. Somewhere near the door, someone whispered a single word. "Affair." And the spell broke. Edward stepped forward, hands half raised, as if he could calm a fire that was already swallowing the room. His voice trembled under a thin veil of control. "Margaret," he said softly, "this isn't the place." She tilted her head, her smile terrifyingly calm. "Then where would you like to have this conversation, Edward? Behind closed doors again? Where the truth goes to die?" The crowd stiffened. The string quartet had stopped entirely. Even the chandeliers seemed to hum with tension. Evelyn, still by the column, felt the weight of dozens of eyes turned toward her. Her fingers tightened around her glass until her knuckles turned white. The dress that once shimmered like soft waves now felt like a spotlight she couldn't escape. Edward cleared his throat, forcing authority into his voice. This is our anniversary. I will not let you turn it into a circus. But Margaret was beyond intimidation now. Decades of unspoken things sat behind her eyes like a storm held too long. A circus, she whispered. Edward, this is the circus. You built it. You brought in the audience. I'm just handing out the truth. A small gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone near the cake table stepped back. Others exchanged wide-eyed looks, the way people do when tragedy is unfolding but they can't look away. Edward's hands dropped to his sides. His shoulders sagged, his polished facade slipping inch by inch. Margaret's voice softened, not gentle, but sharp enough to cut through bone. Do you remember what you said to me the day you gave me this ring? She lifted her hand, the dull gold band catching the light like a bruise. You said I was the only woman you'd ever love. Edward's lips parted, but the words refused to come. His silence was louder than any scream, and then Evelyn made a mistake. She stepped forward. Not much, just a hesitant shuffle closer to Edward. But in a room where every glance mattered, it was enough. It was as if she had crossed an invisible line. Dozens of heads turned. Someone hissed softly. Margaret's gaze snapped toward her. Ah, she said, voice like broken glass. The guest of honor number 2. Evelyn opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her throat burned with fear. Her heart beat so violently she could hear it in her ears. She hadn't wanted it to go like this. Not here, not now. Edward spun toward her. Don't, he hissed under his breath. But it was too late. Margaret's voice rose, not a scream, but steady, commanding, undeniable. 60 years of loyalty, she said. 60 years of silence. And this is what stands beside him tonight. The crowd erupted, not in noise, but in motion, whispering, turning, the sound of 100 judgmental eyes locking onto Evelyn. Her skin flushed crimson. Edward's mask cracked. Margaret, he snapped, louder now. Enough! She turned to him with a kind of calm that chilled everyone in the room. No, Edward. Enough was 50 years ago when I first saw the way you looked at other women. Enough was every time I told myself it was nothing. Enough was when I decided to protect your reputation instead of my dignity. The weight of her words pressed down on him. For the first time, Edward looked small, not the powerful, polished man everyone knew, but an aging figure clutching lies like crumbling paper. Evelyn's breath came in short gasps. The whispers were sharp now, cutting through her like knives. She could feel her carefully hidden life unraveling thread by thread. I loved you, she finally blurted out, her voice shaking. The words hit the room like a gunshot. A gasp rippled through the guests. Margaret closed her eyes just for a moment, not from surprise, but from the bitter confirmation of what she'd always known. Edward's face drained of color. Evelyn, he muttered, barely audible. Margaret opened her eyes again, calm, cold. There it is, she said softly. The truth, not whispered in corners anymore. One of Edward's oldest friends stepped forward. Edward, is this true? Edward tried to speak, but the words tangled in his throat. He could feel the weight of 60 years bearing down on him, not the weight of love, but of every lie layered carefully beneath it. Evelyn's tears finally came. I didn't mean for this to happen, she whispered. He promised me things. Margaret laughed, not cruelly, but like someone finally breathing after drowning for too long. Of course he did. He's good at promises. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, surrounding them like a tide. Margaret turned to face them all, not just Edward and Evelyn, but the friends, the family, the people who thought they knew their love story. Her voice rang clear and steady. This is what 60 years looks like, she said. A house built on cracks that everyone pretended not to see. Tonight, the walls fell. The air was electric, thick with judgment, shame, truth. Edward lowered his gaze. Evelyn clutched her glass. and Margaret stood in the center of it all, no longer a silent wife, but the author of her own ending. The whispers became silence again, but this time, it was not the silence of secrets. It was the silence that comes after a bomb goes off. And somewhere, deep in that quiet, the first real fracture of Edward's perfect world echoed like a scream. No one moved. Not the guests with their half-raised glasses, not Evelyn with her trembling hands, not Edward standing at the center like a man suddenly stripped of everything he had built. Margaret stood before them all, steady, composed, radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the soft lighting or the gown. It was the radiance of a woman who had finally stopped lying to herself. The air in the ballroom had changed. The glittering chandeliers no longer felt warm. They hung above like a jury, casting sharp light on every face. There was no music now, just the faint hum of electricity and the uneven rhythm of heavy breaths. Edward took a single step forward, his voice breaking. "Margaret, please, don't do this." She turned slowly to face him. There was no fury in her expression anymore, no tears, only clarity. "I'm not doing anything," she said quietly. "You already did." A collective murmur swelled and then faded again. Evelyn's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor like the lie they'd all been standing on. Champagne spread across the polished wood, a perfect golden ruin. She gasped softly, covering her mouth, but all eyes were still on Margaret. Margaret glanced down at the broken glass. "How fitting," she murmured. "That's what trust sounds like when it hits the floor." Edward tried to reach for her, but she stepped back, not in fear, but with deliberate, controlled distance. "Margaret, it didn't mean—" "Don't," she said just one word. It froze him mid-step. Her gaze didn't waver. "For 60 years I stood beside you. I carried your name. I smiled when people said we were the perfect couple. I told myself that love meant forgiveness, that loyalty meant silence." She inhaled slowly, a breath weighted with decades. "But tonight, silence ends." The guests were statues now, trapped between the lives they thought they knew and the truth unraveling in front of them. Evelyn's voice came small and cracked. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I never—" Margaret looked at her, and Evelyn fell silent before finishing. "You don't owe me apologies," she said softly. "You owe them to yourself." Edward's jaw tightened. He looked around, searching for a familiar face, some lifeline among the crowd, but all he saw was stares, pity, shock, judgment. "I loved you," he whispered, as if saying it might fix something. Margaret's laugh was soft, empty of joy. "No. You loved the woman who protected your lies. You loved my silence. But you stopped loving me the day you needed someone else to keep you alive." The room pulsed with the weight of it. Some guests looked away, unable to bear the intimacy of watching something so private collapse so publicly. Others leaned in, caught in the slow, devastating theater of truth. Margaret walked to the table and lifted her champagne glass, the same one she had held when she delivered her speech hours earlier, when the night had still shimmered with the illusion of celebration. She raised it now with terrifying elegance. "This," she said, her voice clear as crystal, "was supposed to be a toast to 60 years of love. But instead, it's a toast to finally telling the truth. To every woman who learned to make herself small, to keep a man's world from falling apart. To every lie dressed as love." Her hand didn't shake. She tilted the glass, letting the champagne spill slowly, deliberately, onto the floor. Drop by drop, it soaked into the golden puddle around the shards of Evelyn's broken glass, a single shimmering mess. Evelyn choked on a sob. Edward's shoulders caved, the image of strength finally crumbling. He reached out again, and this time Margaret didn't even flinch. She looked at him like a stranger. "You'll tell your version tomorrow," she said. "You'll say I humiliated you, that I went mad, that it was all a misunderstanding. But tonight I'm done protecting a man who never protected me." A beat of silence. Edward whispered, Please. Margaret lowered the empty glass. No, she said simply. Not anymore. Then she slipped the wedding ring off her finger. For 60 years it had never left her hand. She placed it gently on the table. It made the smallest sound, a delicate metallic click. Yet it echoed like a gunshot through the room. Gasps, murmurs. Evelyn turned away, pressing her shaking hands to her mouth. Edward stared at the ring as if watching the last piece of his world leave him. Margaret straightened her shoulders and looked around the room. This is my story now, she said, not his. Then, with the calm of a woman finally free, she walked away from the table, from Edward, from Evelyn, from 60 years of silence. No one stopped her. No one dared. The guests parted like water, their eyes following her until the doors of the ballroom closed behind her. Edward stood alone at the center of what was once their celebration. Evelyn was crumpled in the corner, mascara streaking down her face. The chandeliers above flickered slightly, as if even they were exhausted by the weight of the night. A friend stepped closer to Edward. "What now?" he whispered. Edward didn't answer. His voice was gone. His world, the perfect picture he had painted for decades, lay in shards on the ballroom floor, glinting under too bright light. And somewhere beyond the heavy doors, Margaret took her first deep, unburdened breath in 60 years. The truth had burned everything down. But for her, it was the first night of freedom.